dark, cold, and eerie. These are the only words I can use to describe the house where I had lived for most of my life with my family. Mostly dark, blistering cold during the endless Indiana winters, and always eerie. Sometimes, strange noises would echo from the cellar below, sounds that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Scraping, faint tapping, even the occasional low moan that seemed to vibrate through the wooden floors. The house itself was a crumbling relic of a time long past, perched on an expanse of barren farmland in Hollow Ridge, Indiana. The nearest neighbor was over a mile away, and even they had moved out a few years ago. It was just me, my mother Karen, and my Uncle Victor. Uncle Victor moved in after my dad left when I was 7. I'd always despised my father, his absence leaving an ache in my chest that I'd tried to bury beneath layers of anger. My uncle had become a father figure to me in his absence, and we were close in ways that sometimes unsettled my mother. Uncle Victor had a peculiar sense of humor and loved to tell ghost stories. "It's all fun, Annie," he'd say, smirking when my mother rolled her eyes at his tales. No harm in a little imagination. But they weren't just fun to me. Those stories stayed with me long after the lights went out. Victor's favorite story was about a creature he called the Watcher. The Watcher, he said, was a tall, twisted thing with limbs that bent at impossible angles and eyes like empty voids. It came for people who refused to sleep, hiding in the shadows, watching from the darkness. "If you don't stay asleep, Annie," Victor would whisper, "the Watcher will come for you. And trust me, he doesn't like being seen." My mother hated those stories. "You'll scare her to death, Vic," she'd scold. She wasn't entirely wrong. The house, with its perpetual drafts and eerie creaks, made it easy to believe in Victor's stories. Sometimes I'd lie awake in my room, convinced I could hear something outside, the scratching of branches against the glass or the faintest of footsteps on the wooden floor. It always made my heart race, but I never dared to tell anyone. One night, after a particularly vivid nightmare, I found myself staring at the ceiling, the weight of the darkness pressing down on me. I reached for my bedside lamp, but I stopped halfway. It was almost as if the darkness didn't want me to break it. I turned over instead, pulling the covers tight around me. That's when I heard it. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was faint at first, like the sound of nails raking softly against the glass. I froze, my pulse thudding in my ears. The noise continued, rhythmic and deliberate. Against every instinct screaming at me to stay hidden, I turned my head to the window. Nothing. Just the reflection of my pale face staring back at me. The scratches stopped as soon as I moved, and I let out a shaky breath. Must be a branch, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. But deep down, I knew better. There wasn't a single tree near that window. The next morning, the scratches played over and over in my head. They were too deliberate to be random. I convinced myself I needed to investigate. Victor would always say curiosity was what kept life interesting. But when I crept into the cellar later that day, I realized he'd never told me that curiosity could be terrifying. The cellar was worse than I remembered. It smelled of damp earth and mold, the air thick with dust that clung to my throat. As I rummaged through old boxes, I came across a drawing, a yellowed piece of paper crumpled at the edges. It was a crude, childish sketch of a tall, grotesque figure. Its limbs jutted out at unnatural angles, and its black, hollow eyes seemed to stare into my soul. I flipped the paper over, noticing the faint pencil marks at the bottom. "Please stay awake." The handwriting was mine, but I had no memory of drawing it. My hands trembled as I folded it and stuffed it into my pocket. That night, rain lashed against the windows, the sound almost soothing compared to the creeping thoughts invading my mind. I tried to sleep, but my nerves were frayed, my pulse quickening at every noise. At 3 a.m., I woke to a strange stillness. The rain had stopped, but the room felt colder than ever. My breath hung in the air, visible even in the darkness. For a moment, I thought I was alone. Then, from the corner of my eye, I caught movement outside the window. A tall figure stood in the yard, just barely illuminated by the pale light of the moon. I scrambled out of bed and ran to Uncle Victor's room. "Uncle Victor," I hissed, shaking him awake. "There's someone outside." He blinked at me, groggy. "What?" "Annie, it's probably just an animal." "No, I saw it. It's not an animal." Victor sighed, grabbing his shotgun from beneath the bed. "All right, kid, show me." We stepped outside, the cold biting into my skin. I pointed to the tree near my window. Victor approached cautiously, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He rounded the tree and... nothing. "See? Told you," he said, his voice tinged with annoyance. But as he turned back toward the house, his flashlight caught something carved deep into the tree bark. Long, jagged scratches, each one spaced apart like claw marks. Victor stared at them, his face pale. "Go inside," he muttered. That night, the tapping on my window returned. It was louder this time, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. The sound sent shivers down my spine. When it stopped, I thought I was safe. But then a voice, low, guttural, and far too close. "Please, stay awake." I bolted from my bed, running into the hallway. The house felt colder, emptier. That's when I saw it. The creature stood there, holding Victor's lifeless body in its arms. His chest was carved with the same words, "Please stay awake." I stumbled back, my screams trapped in my throat. When I finally reached my mother's room, the sight made my knees buckle. Her body lay in a pool of blood, her arm ripped clean from its socket. Written in her blood on the floor were the same haunting words. I collapsed, sobbing, unable to comprehend the horror. When I looked back, the creature was gone. Only silence remained. The police found me hours later, curled up beside my mother's body. They didn't believe me, of course. How could they? All they saw was a blood-soaked girl and two bodies. Now I sit here in this cold, dark cell, alone with my thoughts. Outside, the rain is falling again, heavier than ever. And just now, I heard it. Tap, tap, tap.